And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Kate Knorr.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I've been to these lunches before, so it's exciting that I get to speak and share a little bit about myself and what we do at Illinois Right to Life and why this month is so important. Couple of things, a couple of notes before I get started. The first question that I always get asked, and I like to just get it out of the way, is how old I am, because everyone tells me that I look really young for this job. And some days I feel like maybe that's true. So I'm 27. I grew up in Illinois. I went to high school at Joliet Catholic down in Joliet, and then I went to college at the University of Iowa. While I was at Iowa, I was a journalism student, and during my time as a journalism student, I covered the 2012 Republican caucus. So that's really when I started to get into politics, and I started to really learn about what the issues, how issues that are discussed at the federal level and also at the state level how they actually impact each of us as individuals. My family, I grew up in a pro-life family. I grew up in a very Catholic family. My family, we went to the March for Life in DC on numerous occasions. I went to the March for Life Chicago on numerous occasions. And so this was already a major part of my values and the virtues that I carried with me in my life. But it wasn't necessarily at the forefront of my mind, the abortion issue. So I was a writer for our student newspaper, and I was covering the 2012 Republican caucus, and I started really thinking about this whole political thing and realizing how intriguing it was to me and how interesting I found it. During this time, came to the conclusion that media wasn't necessarily the place to actually discuss truth. I had a couple of run-ins with my editors, and I felt like maybe this isn't the direction I want to go. I'm passionate about truth. I'm passionate about sharing the truth with people who don't know it, don't have it, and that was very, very core part of my personal mission, and so I decided to move away from journalism. So at that time, I decided I'm going to get into politics. I'm going to use my writing skills, my communication skills to help pro-life candidates be elected to office. So that's what I did for a couple of years after school. And it's interesting, I don't think that consciously I recognized what I was doing when I was exploring potential candidates to work for, but the pro-life issue was always a litmus test for me. And not just, are you pro-life or are you not, but how pro-life are you? You know, are you a Peter Breen? Are you willing to actually stick your neck out? Or do you have some exceptions and you say it because Republicans have to be pro-life to be successful in this state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So realized over time that had sort of become a litmus test for me. Sort of started to dive a little deeper into that. And then when I moved back to Illinois in 2016, and Governor Rauner signed House Bill 40 in 2017. And I was absolutely irate as someone who had worked on political campaigns, and I knew that I had friends who were solid Republicans, solid conservative Catholics, pro-life Catholics. I knew that they had worked for him, that they had voted for him, and I took it very personally. I felt very betrayed by that decision. So that day, I went on Illinois Right to Life's website, and I thought, I wonder if they're hiring, and now here we are 2 years later. So it's been a real mercy in my life. It's been a real mercy in my life to work for Illinois Right to Life. I think that God has done a lot of work on me in this time. And I love when I have the opportunity to speak to Catholic groups, because Illinois Right to Life, I would say that a lot of the people who work for us, everyone who works for us is Christian. Many of the people who work with us, whether they're on our board or on our staff, are Catholic. But for me personally, Illinois Right to Life is a secular organization, so for me personally, when I get to stand up in front of a Catholic group and talk about this issue, it really does take a different, it's a little bit different for me, because I get to share some things that are more biblical and scriptural and at the core of our faith that we don't necessarily talk about when we're, at a public school or at the University of Chicago or something like that. Just in light of that, I'll go ahead and jump right in. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about how the title of my talk was A Catholic Response to Abortion War Making. And I use that term war making. I don't use that lightly, because I really believe, and as I've been in this work over the last 2 years, it has become increasingly clear to me all the time that this is a deeply spiritual battle that we face. I some of our staff is here, and we joke that I kind of get spiraling, that I start talking about the demons and things, and it's funny, but it's true. It's true. So I want to share a little bit of that with you, some of the scriptural and the biblical background behind why I believe this is truly at the core of Satan's enmity with women. And then I want to get into a little bit what's actually going on specifically in Illinois and how we can address those issues here. So as I said, the abortion issue is not simply scientific or political. In fact, it is deeply spiritual. And the evidence is there in plain sight for us to see and observe for ourselves that abortion is a foundational part of the enemy's war with God for the world, and more specifically for human souls. We see it first and foremost in the strong representation of Catholics who contributed to the pro-abortion, pro-birth control movement from the very beginning. Dr. John Rock was a daily communicant and one of the original creators of the birth control pill, which Pope Paul VI prophesied in Humanae Vitae would be the gateway to more abortions. Father Robert Drinan was a Jesuit priest and a member of Congress in the 1970s. He was simultaneously an ardent supporter, a very public voice for unrestricted abortion. The brains behind the majority decision for Roe v. Wade were Justice William Brennan, a Roman Catholic, former New York Governor Hugh Brennan, former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, both Roman Catholic. If we made a list of the most powerful pro-abortion senators in US Congress over the past few decades, we would see that almost all have been Catholic. Even now, Joe Biden, Andrew Cuomo, Nancy Pelosi, the list truly goes on and on of Catholics in power who simultaneously choose to publicly support abortion. But we see that on the other side as well. The list simultaneously goes on and on of former pro-choice activists who, while converting from pro-choice to pro-life, simultaneously made that conversion to Catholicism. Bernard Nathanson was the founder of NARAL. He was one of the most pivotal players in convincing the public that we needed to have legal abortion in the US, and he eventually became both pro-life and Catholic. While Lila Rose was not a pro-choice activist, she simultaneously had a conversion to Catholicism while she was growing in her pro-life stance. Abby Johnson made the conversion from pro-choice to pro-life and simultaneously became Catholic. So again, the list really goes on and on. Norma McCorvey is another one, Jane Roe, and Roe v. Wade. And right here in the state of Illinois, our very own Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan, who used to once write letters of support to our organization, Illinois Right to Life, has enabled the most extreme abortion legislation in the country to pass through his state legislature. Alice von Hildebrandt, wife of Catholic philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrandt and the writer of a book called On the Privilege of Being a Woman, clarifies that the enmity was always between Satan and the woman because Eve was the mother of the living and Satan was a murderer from the very beginning. In Revelation, we encounter the demise of Satan in a very particular way. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child, and she cried out in her pangs of birth, in anguish for delivery. And another sign appeared in heaven, behold, a great red dragon. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, that he might devour her child when she brought it forth. She brought forth a male child, one who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. St. Irenaeus says in his writings that the enemy would not have been justly conquered unless it had been a man made of a woman who conquered him. And it's for this reason we understand that while Christ is the victor, Mary is the subject of Satan's hatred and greatest enmity. It is a commonly held belief that the final battle would be over marriage and family. In the 1970s, the second wave feminist movement was born when 12 highly educated upper-class women sat around a table in New York City and laid out the steps for a cultural revolution by asking a series of questions. How does one bring about a cultural revolution? Destroy the American family. How does one destroy the American family? Destroy the American patriarch. How does one destroy the American patriarch? Take away his power. How do we take away his power? By destroying monogamy. And how do we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, homosexuality, and abortion. The 20th century is arguably the bloodiest century in world history. The number of people killed is the highest that's ever occurred in a single 100-year period. Bishop Robert Barron noted recently that there is something about the pervasiveness of violence and the destruction of life in the 20th century that has all the marks of the murderer from the beginning. All of this is without counting the 61 million babies who have been aborted in the US since 1973. Roe v. Wade was built on perjury. Jane Roe, Norma McCorvey, was not raped, as her lawyers claimed, nor did she ever actually have an abortion. The devil is the father of lies. Catholic philosopher Peter Kreeft says that abortion is the antithesis of the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is, this is my body given up for you, and abortion is, this is your body given up for me. This idea is consistent with the fact that the Satanic Temple considers abortion a pivotal sacrament. And as Carrie Gress says in her book, The Anti-Mary Effect, all of this is to say that there is yet another reason to consider a high-pitched conflict between Mary and an anti-Mary. The battle between the woman in Scripture and the serpent. The standoff between Satan and Mary saddles Scripture like bookends. The primordial struggle between them started in Genesis and ends in Revelation. So here I want to talk a little bit specifically about what we're seeing in Illinois. The last 2 years, a satanic statue has been erected in the state capitol rotunda during Advent by the Satanic Temple down in Springfield. I personally feel that there are no coincidences, that that's particularly significant when we see what's going on in our state right now. When Brett Kavanaugh was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, Planned Parenthood broke ground on a new facility in Fairview Heights, Illinois, that they just opened in October. Now, we didn't know at the time that they were breaking ground on this facility, but they had owned this building for decades, since the 70s, and had been sitting on it, waiting to use it until the right moment. They had private doctors practicing out of the building as tenants, and they kicked them all out so that they could renovate the building to create what is now what they're considering a regional care center out of Fairview Heights. So they'll perform 11,000 abortions out of that facility annually every year. And for perspective, the third largest Planned Parenthood clinic in the country is here in Aurora, Illinois, and they perform 400 abortions a month. So that's a significant increase to what we're seeing currently in our state. In addition to that, we obviously had the passage of the Reproductive Health Act. The Reproductive Health Act it's so sinister, I can't believe people don't think it's sinister. And I'll go through what's actually in it right now. So first and foremost, it creates a fundamental right to abortion. It actually says that an individual, not a woman, it says that an individual has a fundamental right to abortion in the state of Illinois. And this is really important for some reasons that I'll get into in a little bit. Second, it redefines fetal viability and health of the patient. So what that means here is that for the sake of widening that opportunity for abortion as greatly as we can, they have redefined when a fetus is viable, and they've also redefined how we determine whether or not a woman, whether her life is in danger. And so the reason for this is that they want to be able to, first of all, perform third trimester abortions. So they've now said if a woman has a threat to her mental health, a threat to her financial health, a threat to her relational health, or any other excuse that you can come up with, she is eligible for a third trimester abortion. But they avoid having to have that conversation by widening that opportunity for fetal viability by saying, well, a fetus is not viable under Illinois state law until 26 weeks or whenever the people in the room at the time deem that fetus would be viable. So it's left intentionally vague. It's relative on purpose, basically. It jeopardizes enforcement of the Parental Notification of Abortion Act, and this is actually a law that we believe they're going to challenge and they're going to try to repeal in the spring. Parental notification is a law in Illinois that says that a minor girl who goes into an abortion clinic to receive an abortion, her parents have to be notified 48 hours before she receives that procedure. They want to repeal this law. They say that it puts vulnerable girls at risk, and in the event that her parents are abusive, they will have an opportunity to invoke violence against her if they have received this information from the abortion clinic. So the idea is that if a 14-year-old wants to get an abortion without her parents' knowledge, she's able to do that. And from our perspective, this opens the door wide open for human trafficking victims of abuse to be taken in by their abusers to receive their abortions. That strip of highway between Joliet and Chicago, 55, along 55 and 80 right there, is one of the highest human trafficking intersections in the entire country. So we know that there are human trafficking victims right within this vicinity, right in my hometown where I grew up in Joliet. And that is what they're looking to do here, is they want to widen that opportunity so that there's no question of whether or not those women can receive abortions. It also keeps status quo the licensing and health and safety inspections in abortion clinics in Illinois, which are virtually non-existent. So if you're a nail salon, if you're a tanning salon, if you're a restaurant in the state of Illinois, you have to be licensed and inspected by the Department of Public Health. If you're an abortion clinic in Illinois, you do not have to be licensed or inspected by the Department of Public Health. Not a single Planned Parenthood in the state has ever been inspected by the Department of Public Health in Illinois. And again, these are things that we think that's crazy. Why would they get away with that? And that's where I say this is deeply spiritual, because how sinister is this, that this is where we're sending women to receive their quote-unquote health care. In addition, it forces all private insurance companies to cover abortion with no exception for churches, synagogues, mosques, or other religious institutions to get insurance plans that do not pay for abortions. So the Thomas More Society right now is working on this particular piece. They're building a case that they'll introduce in the state that they believe is the entry point for challenging this law at the state level. And so they've invited some different parties to come in and act as parties on the case, and that's something that they are moving forward, and they believe that if we can challenge that one piece of this, then there is hope that we can challenge the rest if we're able to nullify that one particular part. The next, it now allows non-physicians to do chemical and medical abortions like the dangerous RU-486 for the first time in Illinois. So the reason for this is that it is very, very hard to find an abortionist willing to sit around at an abortion clinic all day long in the state of Illinois. So what they've done here is they've freed up their abortionists for third trimester and late term abortions, second trimester abortions, and now they have nurse practitioners or, quote unquote, someone with the appropriate training to hand out RU-486 pill, which is the chemical abortion pill, which is how most abortions occur nowadays. It removes language with requirements for physicians if babies are born alive in abortions. So prior to this law passing in the spring, there used to be language that required care to be provided to a baby in the event that that he or she was born alive during an abortion. They have repealed that language, so there is no protection for these babies under Illinois law. In fact, the next item on my list is that this law actually says that under Illinois law, a fetus does not have a right to life at all, period. So that is in terms of a baby that's born alive during an abortion, or in the event that a woman is pregnant and she finds, and she, is the victim of an act of violence and she dies or the baby dies, that baby has no right to life under Illinois law, and the person who hurts her theoretically could not be convicted based on the way that this law is written. It also removes the law prohibiting referral fees or kickbacks for abortion referrals, so doctors can now refer women to abortionists and receive a kickback for that, or referral for that. And it removes the requirement for county coroners to investigate a maternal or fetal death due to abortion. So in the event that a woman actually dies in an abortion clinic, the county coroner should not go in. Again, it's intentionally vague. So the idea is, it's very clear that the intent of this law is to protect abortionists and abortion clinics in the state of Illinois, and certainly not to protect the health of women. I would additionally add, it's not on my list, but I would add that this law also repealed all of the guidelines for how those babies' bodies should be disposed of. So there's no legal requirement for the way that we dispose of those bodies. And this is a key piece here, because we believe, and I don't know, Steve, I don't remember who said this, but someone that we are in relationship with shared that they believe that that's the weak spot of the abortion industry, because they have these other private companies who come in and pick up their medical waste, and all of these fetuses, all of these babies, we don't know where they're going. That's why we see what we saw with Dr. Klopfer out in Indiana. He had 2,400, I think, babies' bodies hidden in his personal property. So this is what's happening in Illinois, and it's sinister not only in the details of the law, it's also sinister in the way that it happened. We had roughly 20,000 witness slips. Some of you may have filed witness slips during this process. A witness slip is basically a formal statement on the record with a House or Senate committee in the state legislature that says, I'm a resident of Illinois, I either support or oppose this legislation. We had 20,000 witness slips filed in opposition to this legislation. Our lobbyist, Ralph Rivera, has been doing this for 30 years, and he said never in the 30-year history of his career in the state capitol has he seen any issue at all, point blank, zero, accrue the number of witness slips that this bill accrued in opposition. But the state legislature does not care. We had 5,000 people show up at the state capitol to protest this legislation back in March of last year. The legislators who introduced this bill introduced a resolution on the House floor that accused us of bullying them and said that 4 legislators needed police escorts because they feared for their lives. I personally went down to the Illinois State Capitol Police Department and asked to see their logs from that day. Not a single legislator requested a police escort. This is how they operate. They lie. And I tell people all the time, if you really want to know what's going on with Illinois abortion, with the abortion industry in Illinois, get on Personal PAC's email list. Personal PAC, PAC, Political Action Committee, is the name of the abortion PAC that runs this whole gamut. And Terry Cosgrove is the president of Personal PAC. He's been doing this almost as long as Mike Madigan. I think they're neck and neck for the longest serving whoever in the state of Illinois. You know, Terry Cosgrove's been doing this for about 30 years, and he has it down to a science. So what they do is it's a coveted endorsement. The Personal PAC endorsement is a coveted endorsement in Democratic primaries in the state of Illinois. So what they do is they set up with all of their candidates, they say, okay, if you sign on the dotted line, if you agree to all of this potential legislation that probably won't come up, but might come up, if you agree to vote for it, we'll endorse you and support your campaign. And that's how they get all of these legislators to sign on with Personal PAC. Tara Costa Howard is at the top of that list. She's the woman who defeated Peter Breen last year in 2018, and Peter's running for re-election against her. So, all of that said, I do have some suggested solutions for you. The question that I get a lot is what do we actually do now that this is our situation here in Illinois? From the national perspective, Planned Parenthood said months ago that they were going to leverage states like Illinois, New York, and California to make up their bottom line elsewhere. And they fully believe that Roe v. Wade will be overturned within 5 to 10 years, probably within 5 years. So that's what they're preparing for. That's why they've pushed this law through. That's why they're setting up their regional care center down in Fairview Heights, which is a very easy access point for other states in the Midwest, because they believe that if they can set up shop in Illinois and get their claws in as tightly as possible, they can continue to run their business out of these states and send women from the states where abortion will soon be illegal to Illinois to receive their abortions. And that's why they're fighting tooth and nail to keep this to push legislation like this through, and that's why they're insistent on repealing parental notification in the spring, because they believe that that's another key part of widening this opportunity for abortion. We know that the youngest girl to receive an abortion in 2017 and have it paid for with taxpayer funding was 10 years old. So that tells us everything we need to know about their widening their opportunity for abortion. We also know that that's why they started in this last year a free birth control program out of all Planned Parenthoods in Illinois, because birth control is a lead creator for Planned Parenthood. They know that if they can get young girls coming in to receive their birth control very early, within the first year that a teenager is on birth control from Planned Parenthood, 16% of them come back pregnant looking for an abortion. That's a pretty high turnover rate. So that's their intent there, is let's create that relationship, and eventually her birth control will fail, she will get pregnant, and she will need an abortion, and when that time comes, she'll be looking for us. And Planned Parenthood believes that if a woman gets 1 abortion, she's good for between 3 and 5 abortions. So, and I would add too, before I continue, I would add that specifically as Catholics, this is a particular issue for us. So one of the things that we did this last fall is that we did a tour where myself and Steve, our program director, traveled around to total, I think about 20 churches all over the state of Illinois, teaching a 2-hour training. The first hour was, here's how you have a pro-life conversation. The second hour was similar to what I'm expressing to you all right now. My number one takeaway from all of these events that we did, number one takeaway, was that the Catholic Church has an unaddressed issue with abortion, with post-abortive women in the church. And I spoke with someone last week who told me that she's been doing this for 30 years. She works in post-abortive counseling. She says that she believes, based on the numbers that she's seen, that as many as 40% of Catholic women in the US are post-abortive. That is a serious, serious problem. And the story that I heard from many women who were in these churches who call themselves pro-life but had at one time or another had an abortion, the story that many of them shared with me was, I told my pastor that we needed a post-abortive counseling, and he told me that we don't have that problem here. So I would encourage all of you that when you go home to your parishes and if you have the opportunity to have that conversation with your parish priest, this is an issue that we need to get out in front of, because it's a cycle that only perpetuates itself. But there is one very specific solution that I want to offer you, and it's something that I believe in deeply, and I think that as we, in light of this whole conversation about the spiritual dimension of abortion and the relationship that it has when we're talking about Satan and his enmity with the woman, there's a particular solution here that I found in this book called Peacework by Henry Nouwen. And there's a couple of things that I want to share right here. So Nouwen suggests that action is absolutely necessary when one is in pursuit of peace in general. But what in this case does action actually look like? This is from Henry Nouwen's book, quote, "Thus the act of prayer is the basis and source of all action. When our actions against the arms race are not based on the act of prayer, they easily become fearful, fanatical, bitter, and more an expression of survival instincts than of our faith in God." What is the concrete day-to-day implication of this view of prayer? It is that we often have to take time to pray and recognize prayer as the first and foremost act of resistance against the arms race. By allowing ourselves quiet time with God, we act on our faith that the peace we want to bring is not the work of our hand or the product of movements we join, but the gift of Christ. It is only this deep rootedness in God's all-inclusive love that we can prevent the peacemaker from being ravaged by the same anger, resentment, and violence that leads to war. What has all this to do with the work of resistance? It means that only a loving heart, a heart that continues to affirm life at all times and places, can say no to death without being corrupted by it. A heart that loves friends and enemies is a heart that calls forth life and lifts up life to be celebrated. It is a heart that refuses to dwell in death because it is always enchanted with the abundance of life. Indeed, only in the context of this strong, loving yes to life can the power of death be overcome. I therefore want to say clearly as I can that the first and foremost task of the peacemaker is not to fight death, but to call forth, affirm, and nurture the signs of life wherever they become manifest. What is Peter's response to this lion? Resist him, he says, solid in faith. And that indeed is the summary of the spiritual response to any threat. It is the faithful resistance, a resistance based not on our experience, skills, intelligence, or willpower, but on our faith in Christ, who has already overcome the powers of evil and death that rule the world. Through Christ's victory over all death, individual as well as collective, death has no final power over us any longer. It is hard to overcome our tendency to consider resistance as the active part of peacemaking and prayer as its contemplative part. But I am increasingly convinced that we will fully grasp the meaning of peacemaking only when we recognize not only that prayer is a form of resistance, but also that resistance is a form of prayer. So, what is the form of prayer that we use? In consideration of what we now know, that Satan's enmity as the original murderer has always been with women, it is a sure thing that the rosary is the most important weapon. In fact, Padre Pio said that the rosary is not simply a weapon, it is the only weapon. So I leave you with that. Thank you so very, very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you, and I hope that you took something from it. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, sure.
I would just like to reiterate what Mary Kate said, that when I was very active in the pro-life movement, and I would often ask the priest, why don't we ever hear any sermons or homilies on abortion, and they would say, "Mary Ann, you don't understand. There are people in the congregation that have had abortions." And I said, "Well, first of all, maybe if you had spoken about it, they wouldn't have had an abortion in the first place. But they particularly need post-abortion counseling. They're hurting. They need to be told that they can be forgiven and come back to the church." And it isn't being done. Mary Kate is exactly right. It isn't being done in the churches at all. Do you have any questions? Yeah, Preston?
Great presentation, Mary Kate. Thank you. So, do you have any idea how many out-of-state mothers come in to have abortions committed on them?
So there's not really a way for us to track that, largely because we know, first of all, that, so for the sake of funding, this is a concern for many reasons for us, but it's a concern, one of the concerns that we have is that we believe women are coming in from out of state and having their abortions paid for with taxpayer funding in Illinois because of the way that the process is set up. So the people who would check that information are actually advised by the state not to ask for residential proof of residency or proof of income. I think they simply ask the woman whether or not she needs aid. If she says yes, they provide it to her. So there's not really a way for us to know where they're coming from. I can tell you the Hope Clinic is down on the St. Louis, Missouri border, the St. Louis border, and it's in Illinois. And a woman called our office not too long ago, and she shared that she prays there every day, and that the parking lot is full of cars from other states every single day. So we know that that's an issue. The Chicago Abortion Fund is the name of an organization that's actually their mission, is to help women from other states travel to Chicago to receive their abortions. There's a hotel, I think it's the Hyatt, we gotta check that, but I believe the Hyatt in the Loop provides discounted room rates for women who are coming in to receive abortions, and if they can show proof that they have scheduled an abortion at one of the family planning clinics in the Loop, they will provide them with a discounted room.
Okay.
Saul Alinsky's tactics are used by the politicians down in Springfield, but they're also used within the church, right? And recently we had the Bishops' Conference. Bishop McElroy got up and talked about that there are other issues that are not, so abortion isn't the primary issue. In Chicago, from what I understand, our cardinal sided with him. So it feels like we don't even have full commitment from within the Catholic Church hierarchy, even here locally.
Yeah.
Is that your perspective as well?
That's my perspective. Let me say this. I have many good friends who are seminarians at Mundelein, two in particular that I was just with them at a conference last week, and we had many conversations about this topic in particular. I have so much faith for the priests who are coming up, and I have faith with many of the priests that we do see talking about this issue, because for every priest you have who maybe falls into that category of, well, abortion's not really my top priority and let's talk about immigration or something else. You have another who this is at the core of their personal mission, and they're talking about it not only from the pulpit, but they're also ministering to women, and they're really providing women who come to them in confession and say that they're post-abortive with solid resources. I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and I think as the laity, we have to really, I think it's twofold. We have to really challenge our priests to take a leadership and take an active role on this, but I think we also have to show them that they will have our support once they do. I think that many priests are afraid of the response that they'll get from the congregation. And one of my good seminarian friends told me almost word for word what he said to me was, I would rather be a priest who, these days when you're walking out in public as a priest or you have a collar on as a seminarian, people shout obscenities at you because of the sex abuse scandal. He said, I would rather be a priest than talk about abortion and do what you do. And I think that men specifically have a great fear of talking about this issue. But what I shared with him, and what I think is very important, and it was reiterated by the Sisters of Life at this conference we were at, they did a luncheon for the seminarians and they talked to them very specifically about spiritual fatherhood. And I shared with him that it is the natural order that men must lead us in all things. So men have to be willing to stand at the forefront of this issue, and I think that we need to challenge our priests on that, and we also need to support them when they do choose to stand up. But I guess my comment would be just that I think in the future we'll see that there is a shift occurring, and I think we have to continue to pray for the leadership in our church.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Jerry?
Are there any, you mentioned that there's quite a few post-abortive women among Catholics. Are there any programs, ministries, or anything like that that address that
Yeah.
within the Catholic Church?
There are. So Project Rachel's Vineyard, we have that program in the Archdiocese, and most dioceses across the country have some form of that program. So there's a retreat opportunity that these women can go on, like a post-abortive healing retreat. Also in the Joliet Diocese, I know that Father Burke Masters, and for any of you who are familiar with him, he used to be the vocations director down in Joliet. He does regular healing retreats that are open for all people, but I recently expressed to him that I think there needs to be something specifically for post-abortive women, because I think we're having more women come out and talk about it. But that's what I would recommend is Project Rachel and Rachel's Vineyard, yeah.
Gloria?
Just ask the question I was going to ask about Project Rachel. Because at one time, it was the premier movement, and I haven't heard of it in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Mother Angelica, PWTN, whom I am enjoying to know, pushed that very hard down there, and therefore the programs were.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they have great programs, that
Right.
came out of that picture. But I truthfully have not heard of Project Rachel for 2 years.
I think that what we see in parishes now is that the extent of the exposure to Project Rachel is a pamphlet in a plastic case on the side of the, as you're walking out of church, that nobody stops ever to look at because it's been there for, 4 years, 5 years. And that's why I say we need to start talking about this. Priests need to talk about it from the pulpit. And I think also, in general, the parishes that we've seen the most movement in terms of a growing Respect Life ministry, but also movement with with reaching out to post-abortive women, is because one woman stood up and decided, I'm going to be the one to share my story so that other women will feel like they can share their story. And I think we have found that is typically how this looks. So every woman that I spoke to along those lines, she had had an abortion, had experienced healing in some shape or form, decided to share her story, and then as a result has had all of these women come to her and ask her, where can I get resources, how can I heal? There's a priest in Shanahan who shared with me once that he has women who come and confess to him over and over and over the same abortion that they had 25 years ago, and it's because these women aren't actually experiencing healing. So the retreats are key, and it's not that the resource isn't there or that it doesn't work. I think it's that we are so afraid to talk about this issue publicly. And women, we all need to be talking about it, but I personally feel very convicted that specifically men need to be talking about this, because that is just the natural order. That's the way that things need to be.
Okay, John?
Right, you're so right about the women come back and confessing. They feel that they've done such a horrible thing. They just can't accept the fact that there's such thing as mercy and God's forgiveness. You got to forgive everything and anything. But aside from that, there's a push nationally to allow over-the-counter, essentially, the abortion pill. And can you say anything about that? It's a very significant thing.
So in California, they just passed a law that college health centers are now required to carry the abortion pill. So that's concerning for a lot of reasons, and I think they're kind of piloting this idea in California because California is more receptive to some of these things, and they're specifically targeting college campuses because they know that they'll get a lot of traffic there, they'll get a lot of business. So RU 486, because of the way that it works, well, there's a couple of concerns here. First of all, the number one concern is we'll now have college-age girls having abortions, taking that medication, and then experiencing their abortion, which, while Planned Parenthood says it takes, a couple of days, Abby Johnson had an RU 486 abortion and she bled for like 6 weeks. So we'll have these young girls experiencing this abortion by themselves alone in their dorm rooms, in shared bathrooms. They'll have to go through that. Not only that, but the concern with that is that they've done a lot of conflating RU486 with the morning after pill. And the two are not the same. They don't do the same thing. So the worry here is that you'll have girls go into the health center, pick up an RU486 the morning after they've slept with someone, thinking that it's the morning after pill. And they're now putting a chemical, and they might not even be pregnant. I mean, that's sort of the concern is, do these health centers have the capacity to determine whether or not these girls are actually pregnant? And we found that when we ask those types of questions, typically the answer is no. And I think this is something that we're going to start seeing in other parts of the country. We're also seeing telemedicine abortions, and what that is in more rural communities, people have the option to video chat with a doctor, and the doctor can, again, it's a question of how does that doctor guarantee that that woman is actually pregnant if they're over a video. Nevertheless, this doctor will say, okay, you're pregnant, I'll prescribe you the RU486 pill, and then they can either go pick it up from their pharmacy, or I've heard some people say in some health centers there's like a drawer that the doctor can remotely unlock, and then they'll just open the drawer, take out the medication, and give it to the woman. The reason that they're pushing this so hard lately is that as the Knights of Columbus over the last 3-4 decades have been so successful in putting ultrasound machines everywhere that we can possibly get them. It's once a woman surpasses that age that she's able to actually receive an ultrasound and hear her baby's heartbeat and see the baby on an ultrasound machine, the likelihood that she'll keep that baby increases by like 90%. So they're trying to catch these women as early as they can. And again, this is why I go back to how sinister is this? What reason would they have other than just because they want babies aborted? They want to abort as many babies in that first trimester, in those first 4 weeks, as they possibly can. And RU486 can only be used within those first 10 weeks. So that's why they push that so hard, because it's easy and it feels very invisible and it's less invasive than procedures in the second and third trimester. And while it's cheaper, they don't make as much money off of it, the likelihood that they'll sell a woman on a pill versus a surgical procedure is much higher. And that's why they push so hard right now for that RU486 pill.
I'd just like to say that there is some failure of RU486, and the woman does eventually have to have a surgical abortion when it fails. Also, the woman, oftentimes, if she's far enough in the pregnancy, sees the baby she's expelling at home alone. I wanted to say that the Roussel-Ucloff is what the RU comes from. It was a company in France that developed the RU486 pill, and the president of the company said it was an appalling psychological ordeal for the woman. They haven't spread that news around, but it's a terrible thing for the woman. I think people don't realize that there are many women in the pro-life movement that have had abortions, and they suffer greatly. In many ways, I think the fact that women suffer after they've had an abortion is a positive thing, in that we haven't destroyed women totally, that they can kill their children and walk away and think it's fine, although many of them brag that way, but that they need help understanding that they're forgiven by God. So I think your point about how important that is for the post-abortion healing, that if the priest would talk about that in the church, many people would know they could be forgiven. Yeah. So, any other questions? Okay, Preston.
So what happens if a mother who's pregnant at, say, 16 weeks takes RU486? Can it kill her? What can happen?
Well, I mean, that's interesting. So
if she's going to this telemedicine stuff, and they don't really know how old the baby is.
Yeah, right. So what we might find is either it doesn't abort the baby, and eventually she has to have a surgical abortion. But I would assume that at that point the baby would suffer some significant effects of the medication. So I mean, we see. And granted, I think a lot of these were saline abortions, which don't really happen anymore, but we see abortion survivors nowadays who are adults who have, missing limbs, or, Gianna Jessen was one who is I think actually she came out pretty unscathed, maybe some scarring, but she herself was the victim of a failed abortion. So I think what would probably happen at that point is either the woman continues to carry the child to full term and that child is delivered with significant defects, or she realizes that she's still pregnant and goes in for, at that point, for a surgical procedure.
I think the other thing you might want to mention is the reversal of RU 486.
Yeah.
And that some states are passing laws that require that the people be told when they're given for RU 486 that it can be reversed.
Yeah. So the abortion reversal pill is a pill that was recently developed, and it's actually been proven successful in many instances that if a woman is, if she catches it between 24 and 48 hours and she takes RU486 and then realizes, oh my gosh, what have I done? Basically what RU486 does is it breaks down the uterine lining, so it basically severs that contact between the baby and the woman, and the baby stops receiving blood flow and nutrients. But progesterone is what really builds that uterine lining and that connection. So the abortion reversal pill is essentially just a huge burst of progesterone that will rebuild that tissue. And the hope is that if you can catch it soon enough that the baby will survive and be healthy. And there's been a lot of cases that that's been the case. But now what we're hearing from the media is the abortion reversal pill is very dangerous, and it's not regulated by the FDA, and we don't know what the potential side effects could be. And my response to that is, well, then we obviously know that it's working, otherwise they wouldn't be talking about it. So.
Okay. Back in the back.
Yeah, I think we're all pretty familiar with the number of contemptible politicians who have taken positions in favor of abortion. I've had an opportunity to listen to a number of President Trump's rallies, and he consistently speaks out in favor of right to life and the sacred right to life. And yet, if you don't listen to those rallies, you don't realize that we have such a strong opponent for right to life in the presidency.
Amen.
And I wish more people
Amen.
could be aware of that. I was waiting to see if
Yeah.
you would bring that up, because
Yeah.
it's important that you have.
Oh yeah, and I believe in it. Yep. You can go down the list of all of the pro-life things that he's done. When people say that he's not pro-life, they are sadly mistaken. He is the most pro-life president we've had since Roe v. Wade was ruled on. And he, one of the things, I tell people, look at his action. Let's tweets aside for a second, look at his actions, the fruits of what he's actually done. One of the biggest things for me, before I did this job, before I came into this role at Illinois Rights Life, I was blogging, doing news blogging for Sarah Palin. And so it was around the time that Trump was elected, and I wrote a lot of articles about him. And I did not support him in the primaries. I worked for someone who ran against him. I did not want him to win, and it killed me to vote for him, but I did. And in the year after he was elected that I reported on him, I learned so much about appointments he has made, department heads he has put in particular positions who are not only pro-life, but overwhelmingly Catholic. I mean, we have the Knights of Columbus basically running our federal government right now, which is pretty awesome. So I totally agree with you. I mean, the list is as long as my arm of the pro-life things that he's done, and yeah, he deserves that title. Thank you for mentioning that.
You would think the bishops would support that position, wouldn't you? John, did you want to ask another question?
About something outrageous. The abortion pill reversal is exceedingly successful, and in Virginia, the legislation has been introduced to make it illegal to provide the reversal of medication. I mean, that is speaking of outrageous.
It's just totally antithetical to common sense. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Well, Mary Kate will be here for a while if something comes to your mind on Tuesday.